Chisholm walked into the grand hall filled with colleagues, family, and friends who had gathered to celebrate her promotion. The evening was supposed to be hers, a moment she had worked years for, but her sister Ayanda had other plans. As the waiters carried trays of champagne, and the music played softly in the background, Chisholm prepared to give her short thank you speech. Just as she rose from her seat, Ayanda suddenly clutched her chest and collapsed onto the floor with a loud cry. Gasps filled the room, and within seconds, almost everyone rushed toward Ayanda, leaving Chisholm standing alone, confused and embarrassed. Guests surrounded Ayanda, fanning her and calling for water. Some shouted to bring a doctor, while others whispered that she must have been overwhelmed by emotions. Chisholm sat back quietly, forcing a smile even though she knew her sister's act was nothing but a dramatic attempt to draw attention away from her. Her heart ached as she watched people fuss over Ayanda, forgetting the very reason they had gathered. The laughter, the chatter, and even the music faded, replaced by murmurs about Ayanda's sudden collapse. Chisholm clenched her hands under the table, determined not to let anger show on her face. Just then, the chairman of the company stood up and tapped the microphone, calling everyone back to their seats. The noise slowly died down, and all eyes turned toward the stage. Ayanda was still lying on a chair, pretending to look weak, but the chairman's firm voice carried across the hall. He smiled warmly at Chisholm, and announced with pride that after years of hard work, dedication, and loyalty, Chisholm had officially been appointed the new chief executive officer of the company. The words echoed through the hall, followed by thunderous applause that shook the room. Cameras turned back to Chisholm, journalists rushed forward, and guests cheered loudly. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stood, accepting the honor that was truly hers. Ayanda's fake fainting no longer mattered. No one looked at her anymore. She sat stiff in her chair, her face burning with humiliation as the attention she craved was completely gone. All the lights, all the cameras, and all the respect were back on Chisholm, who walked to the stage with grace. The night ended with her shining brighter than ever, while Ayanda's plan crumbled before her eyes. Ayanda held the microphone with a bright smile, ready to thank everyone who had gathered to celebrate her new role. The hall sparkled with lights, and the guests sat eagerly, waiting for her words. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, her sister Ayanda let out a loud gasp and collapsed to the floor with a dramatic cry. The sound echoed across the room, and immediately people jumped from their seats. Chairs scraped, glasses clinked, and voices rose in panic. Within moments, all eyes turned to Ayanda, lying with her hand on her forehead as if she had lost all strength. Ayanda stood frozen on stage, her voice caught in her throat. She watched helplessly as family members, colleagues, and even the servers rushed toward her sister. Some shouted for water, others bent over fanning her, and a few whispered about calling a doctor. The crowd murmured with pity, saying she must be overwhelmed by the emotions of the evening. No one noticed Ayanda anymore. The microphone felt heavy in her hand, and her heart sank. What was meant to be her shining moment had been stolen so easily, and she could do nothing but watch the drama unfold. Minutes passed, and Ayanda slowly sat up, looking weak but satisfied with the attention she had gathered. The guests sighed in relief, patting her shoulder, asking if she felt better. Ayanda stayed quiet, forcing a small smile, though deep inside she knew her sister's fall was no accident. The hall buzzed with talk of Ayanda's health, and Ayanda's special night seemed ruined. Then the managing director cleared his throat and walked onto the stage, holding a folder in his hand. The room fell silent as he spoke with authority. He explained that the evening was not only to honor Ayanda's professional success, but also to reveal something even greater. He announced that Ayanda had just inherited valuable company shares worth millions, along with ownership of a luxury apartment in the heart of the city. Gasps filled the room again, but this time they were filled with admiration and excitement. The guests turned back to Ayanda, clapping and cheering loudly. Cameras flashed, and everyone rushed to congratulate her. Tears of joy sparkled in her eyes as she finally received the recognition she deserved. Ayanda sat silently, her face pale, realizing that her little performance had failed. The spotlight had returned to Ayanda, brighter than ever, and no one could take it away now that at the gala. Oluchi's sister Chidinma suddenly clutched her head and collapsed to the floor, pretending to faint just as the cameras had turned toward Oluchi. The flashing lights quickly swung away, and reporters rushed over to capture the scene. Guests gasped and crowded around Chidinma, asking if she was all right. Some even shouted for water, while others began fanning her with napkins. The photographers who were supposed to be taking Oluchi's pictures pointed their lenses at Chidinma instead, and the buzz of the room shifted completely. Oluchi stood frozen, watching the drama unfold. She had been waiting for this evening, a night that marked her hard work and her recognition in front of business leaders and investors. But now, all attention had been stolen. The cameras that should have captured her smile were focused on Chidinma's performance. The laughter, the applause, and the excitement faded into whispers about Chidinma's sudden illness. Oluchi's heart sank as she stepped back quietly, not wanting to cause a scene but feeling crushed inside. Minutes passed, and Chidinma slowly sat up, looking pale but pleased with the attention she had gained. People clapped gently, praising her bravery. Oluchi forced herself to stay calm, though she knew her sister's fainting act was nothing more than a ploy. It seemed like the night she had dreamed of was ruined, and her chance to shine was slipping away. Then, just as the crowd began to settle, a tall man in a sharp suit rose from his seat. His face was familiar to many. He was a billionaire investor known for choosing powerful partners. The room grew silent as he cleared his throat and asked for the microphone. He spoke firmly, saying he had come to the gala for a purpose. Then turning to Oluchi, he announced that after careful thought, he had decided to name her as his new business partner. Gasps filled the room, followed by thunderous applause. The cameras swung back to Oluchi, flashing brighter than ever before. Guests stood, clapping and cheering her name. Tears of joy filled her eyes as she walked forward, finally receiving the recognition she deserved. Chidinma sat quietly in the corner, her face burning with shame, as the spotlight she had tried to steal returned to Oluchi, stronger than ever. During her promotion dinner, Kamsi's sister Ngozi suddenly clutched her chest and dropped to the floor, pretending to collapse in the middle of the hall. Gasps filled the air, and chairs scraped as guests rushed from their seats to help her. Some shouted for water, others bent over to check her pulse, and a few even fanned her with napkins. The celebration that was meant for Kamsi was quickly forgotten as everyone crowded around Ngozi, pity written across their faces. The laughter and music that had filled the room moments before turned into murmurs of worry. Kamsi sat silently, watching the scene unfold. She had worked for years to earn this special night, but once again her sister was determined to take the attention. Her heart sank for a moment, but she quickly gathered herself. Instead of reacting or creating drama, she rose from her chair with quiet grace and slipped away. Guests were too distracted to notice her absence, still fussing over Ngozi, who kept her eyes half shut and sighed dramatically, enjoying the sympathy pouring in from the crowd. A few minutes later, the hall doors opened, and Kamsi walked back in. She held a small velvet box in her hand, her face calm but radiant. The room slowly turned their heads toward her, curious about what she carried. She walked straight to the front, stood tall, and opened the box to reveal shining silver keys. Gasps spread again, but this time out of excitement. With a steady voice, Kamsi explained that as part of her promotion, her company had gifted her a luxurious mansion. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Guests who had been worried over Ngozi now cheered loudly, clapping and calling Kamsi's name. The cameras swung toward her, flashing as she lifted the keys proudly. Smiles filled the hall, and the energy returned stronger than before. Kamsi's eyes sparkled with tears of joy as she realized her moment had been restored in a way even greater than she had expected. Ngozi, still sitting on the floor pretending to look weak, could only watch as the spotlight slipped from her grasp. The sympathy she had forced was forgotten, replaced by admiration for Kamsi. The night ended with Kamsi standing tall, holding the keys that symbolized her success, while her sister sat humiliated, unable to steal the moment any longer. Amara stood at the front of the hall, ready to give her short speech. The evening was meant to be a celebration of her promotion, and the room was filled with family, friends, and colleagues who had gathered to honor her. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, her sister Ojeki suddenly let out a loud cry and collapsed to the floor. Gasps filled the room as people rushed to her side. Guests fanned her, someone shouted for water, and whispers spread quickly about her health. The music faded, the chatter stilled, and all eyes were fixed on Ojeki lying dramatically on the ground. Amara stood quietly, her hands shaking as she gripped the microphone. Her heart sank as she realized her special night was slipping away. The cameras turned, and instead of capturing her success, they were focused on Ojeki's act. The moment that should have belonged to her now seemed lost. She bit her lip, fighting back tears, but she stayed composed, refusing to let the disappointment show on her face. While the room was still buzzing with attention on Ojeki, Amara's fiancé suddenly walked forward. He carried a small velvet box in his hand and gently tapped the microphone. The crowd turned, confused, and watched as he dropped to one knee in front of Amara. The hall grew silent, and then he opened the box, revealing a shining ring. Gasps spread across the room once again, but this time filled with excitement and joy. He looked up at Amara with love in his eyes and asked her to marry him. Tears rolled down Amara's cheeks as she covered her mouth in shock. The guests broke into loud cheers, clapping and shouting in delight. Cameras flashed brightly, capturing the beautiful moment as Amara nodded with a smile and said yes. Her fiancé slipped the ring on her finger, and the crowd erupted in applause. The atmosphere completely changed. No one paid attention to Ojeki anymore. She sat quietly in a corner, her plan ruined, while Amara stood in the center of the hall, glowing with happiness. With her promotion and now a surprise proposal, she became the true star of the night. The hall filled with music and laughter again, but this time every eye and every heart was on Amara. At her dinner, Kayamika's sister Ezen suddenly placed her hand on her head and dropped to the floor, pretending to faint. The hall filled with shouts and gasps, and the journalists who had their cameras aimed at Kayamika quickly ran toward the scene. Flashing lights turned away from the stage and pointed at Ezen as she lay dramatically on the carpet. Guests rushed to her side, offering water and fanning her, while reporters whispered among themselves, taking pictures of her collapse. Kayamika stood frozen, still holding the microphone she had prepared to use for her thank you speech. She watched as the celebration shifted completely, her moment buried under her sister's performance. The evening had been meant to honor her years of hard work, but now everyone seemed to forget why they were even there. Her smile faded as she stepped aside, choosing not to argue or call out her sister's act. Inside, she felt the sting of humiliation, but she kept her composure, waiting quietly while the drama dragged on. After a few minutes, Ezen sat up slowly, pretending to look weak and fragile. People clapped gently, relieved that she was okay. The journalists surrounded her, still snapping photos, and whispers filled the room about her condition. Kayamika's heart sank further as she realized her special night seemed ruined. The news cameras had missed her words, and the attention she deserved was gone. She returned to her seat quietly, hiding the disappointment in her eyes. But later that night, when the newspapers and television reports came out, everything changed. The headlines were not about Ezen's fainting, but about Kayamika herself. Bold letters declared her the youngest female executive in the entire country. Pictures of her smiling at the event filled the screens, while reporters praised her achievements and strength. The focus shifted completely, and her story spread far and wide, reaching people she had never even met. Ezen's act was forgotten, buried under the powerful news of Kayamika's success. The very cameras that had ignored her earlier now flashed her name across every platform. Kayamika's eyes welled with tears as she realized that no one could take away what she had earned. The night that seemed ruined became the start of her biggest victory, and she shone brighter than ever, while her sister sat in silence, left out of the glory. Neka stood at the front of the hall, ready to thank everyone who had gathered to celebrate her promotion. The room was filled with clapping and cheerful voices until her sister Zawera suddenly cried out and dropped to the floor, pretending to faint. Guests rushed forward in panic, calling for water, fanning her, and surrounding her with worried faces. The laughter and applause that had been meant for Neka disappeared in an instant. Whispers spread quickly, and instead of talking about Neka's success, people murmured about Zawera's health. Neka remained standing quietly, forcing a smile even though her heart sank. She could hear some guests mocking her under their breath, saying she had been outshined by her sister. The cameras that had been pointed at her turned toward the floor, snapping photos of Zawera lying dramatically. The humiliation was heavy, but Neka chose not to speak. She folded her hands, her calm face hiding the storm she felt inside, while Zawera slowly opened her eyes and accepted the pity around her. Just as it seemed the entire night had been ruined, the doors opened and the family lawyer walked into the hall carrying a stack of papers. His serious face and confident step drew everyone's attention. He greeted the guests and asked for silence. The crowd fell quiet, curious about why he had come. He explained that he had 2 announcements to make, and both involved Neka. First, he confirmed her official promotion, recognizing her years of hard work and loyalty. Then he paused before revealing something that left the hall in shock. The lawyer announced that Neka's late uncle had left behind an estate, and in his will, he had chosen her as the heir. The property, the lands, and the wealth were now legally hers. Gasps filled the room, followed by loud applause and cheers. The same people who had mocked her moments earlier now rushed forward to congratulate her. Cameras turned back to Neka, flashing brighter than before, capturing her stunned but joyful face. Zawera sat frozen in her chair, her plan shattered. The attention she had stolen slipped away as quickly as it came, replaced by admiration for Neka. Tears of relief filled Neka's eyes as she realized her moment was bigger than she had imagined. The night ended with her standing tall, celebrated as both a leader and the new owner of her uncle's estate. Ayub's promotion dinner was in full swing, with music playing and guests smiling as they raised their glasses to celebrate her. Just as she stood to speak, her sister Ijeoma let out a loud gasp and dropped to the floor, pretending to collapse. Gasps filled the room, and the once lively atmosphere turned tense. People hurried from their seats, circling around Ijeoma, calling her name, fanning her, and asking for water. The conversations about Ayub's success vanished, replaced by worried murmurs about Ijeoma's sudden illness. Ayub stood frozen, clutching the microphone with a forced smile. Her heart sank as she watched the spotlight slip away from her once again. She knew her sister well enough to see through the act, but she remained calm, unwilling to create a scene. She stepped back quietly while the guests focused on Ijeoma, their pity directed toward the wrong person. The joyful night she had waited for seemed to fade into a blur of whispers and pity. The crowd continued to murmur, unsure of what was happening, when suddenly Ayub's phone rang. The loud ringtone cut through the noise, and all eyes turned toward her. She answered quickly, and the voice on the other end made her eyes widen in shock. It was the governor himself. With a warm, steady tone, he congratulated her on her promotion, saying he was proud to see such talent and leadership. The hall fell silent as his voice echoed through the speakers, carried live for everyone to hear. Guests gasped, and within seconds, the room shifted. The murmurs stopped, and applause filled the hall once more. Cameras turned back to Ayub, flashing as people clapped and cheered her name. The governor's words made it clear that this night belonged to her, and nothing could change that. Ayub's hands trembled as she smiled, tears glistening in her eyes, realizing that her moment had not been stolen after all. It had been made even greater. Meanwhile, Ijeoma sat up slowly, her face pale with embarrassment as the attention she craved slipped completely away. No one cared about her act anymore. All focus was on Ayub, who stood tall in the center of the hall, now shining brighter than ever. The evening ended with her celebrated not just by her colleagues and family, but by the highest voice in the state. Temitope stood at the center of the decorated hall, smiling shyly as the guests clapped for her promotion. Just as she was about to speak, her sister Adora suddenly let out a dramatic cry and dropped to the floor, pretending to be unconscious. The sound of chairs scraping and gasps filled the room as everyone rushed toward her. Some shouted for water, others bent down to fan her, and a few even suggested calling an ambulance. The lively atmosphere of the dinner disappeared, replaced by worried voices surrounding Adora. Temitope stood frozen, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She knew Adora well enough to realize it was an act, but she stayed quiet, refusing to argue in front of the guests. She clutched her hands together, forcing a small smile even though she felt her special night slipping away. The whispers in the crowd stung her as people focused all their sympathy on Adora instead of acknowledging her achievement. The cameras that had been flashing at her turned away, capturing pictures of Adora being lifted into a chair. Minutes passed before Adora finally opened her eyes slowly, pretending to look weak. The guests sighed in relief and praised her bravery, while Temitope sat quietly, hiding the disappointment in her eyes. It seemed like the night she had worked so hard for had been stolen from her. Then, just as the room was calming down, the company director walked forward with a serious expression. He carried a sealed envelope in his hand and asked for the attention of the guests. The hall grew silent as he announced that there was one more surprise for the evening. He explained that along with her promotion, Temitope had also been gifted documents making her the co-owner of a luxury resort in Lagos. Gasps filled the hall, followed by loud applause. Temitope's eyes widened as the papers were placed in her hands. The weight of them felt like a dream come true. The cameras turned back to her instantly, flashing brighter than before, while guests surrounded her with cheers and congratulations. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she realized her moment had returned, stronger than ever. Adora sat quietly in the corner, her act forgotten, watching as Temitope stood proudly with the gift that proved her success could never be taken away at her event. Samto's sister Chica suddenly dropped to the floor, clutching her chest and pretending to faint. The room gasped, and within seconds, everyone rushed toward Chica, fanning her, offering water, and acting as though she had just survived something dramatic. Samto, who had worked tirelessly for years to reach this moment, stood frozen, feeling her special day slipping away as all eyes turned to her sister's act. The whispers started, and guests clapped when Chica sat up again with a weak smile, pretending to be fragile, but secretly enjoying the attention she had stolen. Samto's heart ached as she realized her own celebration was being overshadowed. The air in the hall shifted, and Samto tried to gather her emotions, forcing a smile while fighting back tears. She wanted this evening to be about her hard work, her sacrifices, and her dreams finally coming true, but instead, it felt like a play staged around her sister. The crowd was still praising Chica's strength when the director of the company stood up, raising his hand for silence. His voice cut through the murmurs, commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his words steady and powerful, "we are not here for drama or distractions. Tonight, we are here for Samto." All eyes turned back to Samto as the director continued. "Not only has she earned her promotion with unmatched dedication, but I am proud to announce something bigger. From today, Samto is not just moving up, she is now the majority shareholder of this company." Gasps filled the hall, followed by thunderous applause that shook the room. The spotlight that had been stolen was suddenly back where it belonged, blazing brighter than ever. Samto's face lit up with emotion as the truth sank in. Her achievements were too great to be dimmed by anyone's tricks. Chica's fake fainting no longer mattered. The guests surrounded Samto with cheers and congratulations, cameras flashing, voices rising in admiration. The same people who had just pitied her sister were now celebrating her success with pure joy. Samto stood tall, realizing that when you have true power and hard-earned success, no amount of distraction can take it away. The night ended with her standing in the center of it all, a true corporate queen. Thank you so much for watching till the end. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories. Bye. 2 hearts.